Our gospel story today of the feeding of the 5,000 shows Jesus leading his disciples and this large crowd through a public contemplative moment, one that cuts through illusions of scarcity and reveals the reality of abundance. Jesus had attracted quite a public following in Galilee. Crowds began following him everywhere, it seemed. In today's reading, Jesus attempts to retreat to a quiet hillside with his disciples near the Sea of Galilee. But instead, his retreat is cut short by the crowds who catch up with him. And the entire series of events that follow, not just this retreat cut short, all of it is occasioned by a contemplative element. Especially if contemplation, as Quaker educator Parker Palmer puts it, he defines it as a way by which we unmask illusion and reveal reality. Defined this way, contemplation doesn't just happen in solitude or small group experiences of tranquility and quiet. It can also occur in public ways, in public spaces, even in very large groups, such as the multitude that Jesus encounters here. Jesus operates within the reality of abundance and unmasks the illusion of scarcity. Now, of course, we live in a world where the gap between scarcity and abundance grows wider every day, it seems, whether at the level of nations or neighborhoods. This widening gap is polarizing people, making each camp more and more suspicious and antagonistic towards the other. The issue asks whether there is enough, to go around, enough food, water, shelter, or land, for example. An ideology of scarcity says no, there's not enough. So hold on to what you have. In fact, don't just hold on to it. Put aside more than you need, so that if you do need it, it will be there, even if others must do without. And then defend it at all costs. For example, where 1/5 of the world's population consumes nearly 4/5 of its food and associated resources to produce and deliver that food, this leads to the tragic conclusion that when we act on a mentality of scarcity through our prerogatives of privilege and our acquisitiveness and wastefulness, we help make scarcity a very real thing. And that is part of the root of war, both wars happening now and in the future. As many have pointed out, an affirmation of abundance says the opposite. Namely, appearances notwithstanding, there is enough to go around, so long as each of us takes only what we need. If we are willing to have but not hoard, there will even be more than enough left over. Two bold and well-documented claims that have been made over and over again since the issuing of the United Nations Brandt Commission report in the 1970s affirm, first, that there is enough food and food production in this world to feed everyone on the planet, except for the poor ways in which it is distributed to those in need, especially to those in drought or war-plagued areas. And secondly, and more revealing of our global priorities, is the fact that 0.1% of 1 year's worldwide military expenditures would be enough to procure and distribute enough farm machinery and technical assistance and food delivery and distribution in such a way that every part of the world could be food sufficient or self-sufficient. The peculiar and ironic thing is that the people and nations with abundance more or less rely on an ideology of scarcity, while the ones suffering from scarcity more or less rely on an ideology of abundance. How can that be? Well, this all means that we have to look first at the abundance and scarcity we each carry within ourselves, along with the fullness and needs of our households, and then also take into account the realities of wealth and poverty in our society and global community. We thus need to widen our horizons regarding God's abundance in our lives and in the wider world, as a countervailing balance to our anxiety about scarcity. With food, beyond food, Jesus takes his disciples and a crowd of 5,000 or so through a public contemplative process of rediscovering abundance in their midst. When Jesus begins by asking Philip to wrestle with a rhetorical question, quote, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" he forces his disciples to think first along the dead-end road of scarcity. As Philip responds, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. So then Jesus calls them to broaden their imagination and thus their options. His disciple Andrew starts going in the right direction when he discovers a boy in the crowd who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But he then concludes with the same assumption of scarcity as Philip, as he replies, "But what are they among so many people?" So many people, so few loaves. So what's the use? But whether the biblical scene is with 1 cup of cold water, or a widow's mite, or starting with just 5 loaves of bread, Jesus' answer again and again is simply, "Let's see." In the other gospel versions of this same story, the disciples persist in a scarcity mindset by suggesting to Jesus that he send the crowd away into the villages to buy food for themselves. Instead, Jesus guides them in a very different direction, as he operates on a very different set of assumptions. He looks at the same situation that the disciples look at, but where they see not enough, Jesus sees plenty. Plenty of time, plenty of food, and plenty of possibilities with the resources at hand. Not that Jesus knew just how it was all going to work out exactly, but what he does know beyond a shadow of a doubt is that wherever there is plenty of God, there will be plenty of everything else. Rather than using a competitive process, Jesus opts for sharing through a more cooperative process. Rather than sending the crowd away to compete on their own, Jesus calls for the cooperative spirit of a whole community in order to generate abundance in the midst of seeming scarcity. In these other gospel accounts, Jesus tells his disciples, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. Thus urging his disciples to discover that community and abundance go hand in hand. In those other gospel versions of this story, Jesus gathers the large, faceless crowd into smaller, more intimate groupings where everyday miracles have a chance of happening, where they can meet, interact, where abundance will replace scarcity. And lo and behold, like that wonderful children's story, Stone Soup. Who knows that story? A miracle starts to happen. The miracle that there never seems to be enough, even for ourselves, until we start sharing. As Barbara Brown Taylor points out, while Jesus distributes the rather meager rations from the 5 loaves and 2 fish, probably some in that crowd might have laughed, at least quietly, while others would have been mystified, while still others would have been embarrassed for Jesus, that he should have promised so much with so little to deliver. But seeing Jesus believe and then act on his assumptions of abundance, a number of the people themselves begin to realize that they can share what they really have, so that the result is that everyone is satisfied. For what they really have in that crowd of 5,000 is a lot more than 5 loaves and 2 fish. And so, caught up in this moment, they not only witness a miracle, but participate in it. Not just by receiving the food, but in sharing the extra food hidden in their pockets, thus discovering their own capacity for creating abundance, discovering that there never seems to be enough even for ourselves until we start sharing. Now, some of you might point out, as Barbara Brown Taylor does, that what I've just described is not a miracle. That's just human beings being generous, sharing what they have, even when it's not enough to go around. That's not a miracle. That's just a whole crowd of people moving from a sense of scarcity to a sense of plenty, overcoming their fear of going hungry, giving up their need to protect themselves. That's not a miracle. Or is it? You see, the problem with miracles is that we tend to get mesmerized by them, focusing on God's responsibility and forgetting our own. Miracles let us off the hook. They appeal to the part of us that is all too happy to let God feed the crowd, save the world, do it all. After all, what we have to offer is not enough to make any difference. So we hold back and wait for a miracle, looking after our own needs and looking for God to help those who cannot help themselves. However, Jesus says to his disciples in those other gospel accounts, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. Not me, but you. Not my bread, but yours. Not sometime or somewhere else, but right here and now. Stop looking for someone else to solve the problem and solve it yourselves. Stop waiting for food to fall from the sky and share what you have. Stop waiting for a miracle and participate in one instead. So whether it's addressing hunger or the lack of access to adequate education or housing, employment or health care, or ensuring basic human rights, or saving the planet, we cannot just wait for some miracle. Rather, we are all called to be participants in one instead. Without God, we cannot. And without us, God will not, wrote St. Augustine some 1,600 years ago. We have God's abundance in us. That's the realization Jesus wanted his disciples and the rest of us to come to. Whether in the midst of a large and hungry crowd, or out on a storm-tossed sea, or anywhere else our journey with the living Christ takes us. However much or little we have, we are invited to bring it to God and to share it with others, believing that it is enough to begin with, enough to start something, even a miracle. Amen. Using the form on page 53 of our Book of Common Prayer, let us rise as we proclaim our faith, saying together the Apostles' Creed.